I'm leaving you for her. Those 5 words hit me like a freight train loaded with broken glass and disappointment. But little did he know we were already BFFs, and Maya had been keeping me updated on his pathetic attempts at seduction for weeks. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it, metallic and bitter on my tongue as I sat there on our couch. The same couch where he'd probably rehearsed this little speech a dozen times in the mirror. My heart was doing this weird, stuttering thing, like it couldn't decide whether to race or stop entirely, and I could feel this strange, tingling sensation spreading from my chest down to my fingertips. He was still talking, his mouth moving in that earnest way that used to make me melt, but now just looked like a fish gasping for air. Something about how he never meant for it to happen, how Maya just understood him in ways I never could, how they'd connected on this deep intellectual level that transcended physical attraction. Physical attraction, my ass. I knew for a fact that Maya had been laughing about his deep intellectual conversations. Just 3 days ago, over wine and Chinese takeout, she'd done this absolutely devastating impression of him pontificating about cryptocurrency while trying to flex his biceps, and I'd nearly choked on my lo mein. The beautiful thing, and I use that word with the full awareness of how twisted it sounds, was that he had no idea, none whatsoever. In his mind, he was delivering this earth-shattering revelation that would leave me devastated and heartbroken, probably begging him to reconsider. The poor, deluded bastard actually thought he was in control of this situation. My hands were trembling slightly, but not from sadness. It was more like that electric feeling you get right before a thunderstorm, when the air gets all charged and you know something big is about to happen. I could feel my face doing that thing where it goes perfectly blank. Not angry, not hurt, just neutral, like a mask. He was gesturing now, those familiar hands that used to trace patterns on my skin during lazy Sunday mornings, now waving around as he explained how he'd tried to fight his feelings, but couldn't deny the connection anymore. The connection that Maya had been documenting in our group chat with screenshots and running commentary, like she was providing live coverage of the world's most boring sporting event. Jake tried to buy me dinner again. She'd texted just last Tuesday, complete with a photo of his awkward selfie in the restaurant bathroom. Seriously, does he think I'm impressed by Olive Garden? And why does he keep sending me pictures of his abs? I've seen better muscle definition on a scarecrow. I'd sent back a string of crying, laughing emojis and told her to keep stringing him along. I'd been joking then, just enjoying the entertainment value of watching my boyfriend make an absolute fool of himself. I hadn't expected him to actually follow through with leaving me for her. The audacity was almost impressive. His voice was getting that pleading quality now, the one he used when he wanted me to agree that buying another gaming chair was a necessary investment in his future. He was explaining how he hoped we could still be friends, how he valued what we'd had but couldn't ignore his heart anymore. His heart, right. The same heart that had led him to slide into Maya's DMs with pickup lines he'd probably found on Reddit. The same heart that had convinced him to show up at her apartment with flowers last week, the wilted ones she'd immediately thrown in the trash while FaceTiming me about what a sad, desperate gesture it was. I could feel something cold and sharp crystallizing in my chest, like anger was freezing into something harder and more purposeful. The hurt was there too, don't get me wrong. 3 years of my life sitting in this room, watching him explain why I wasn't enough anymore. But underneath the hurt was something else entirely. Anticipation. Because here's the thing about Maya. She wasn't just my best friend. She was my partner in crime, my fellow chaos enthusiast, the person who'd helped me plan elaborate pranks since we were kids. She was also extremely, spectacularly gay, a fact that Jake had somehow missed despite the rainbow flag on her car, the pride stickers on her laptop, and the framed photo of her and her ex-girlfriend that sat prominently on her mantelpiece. Maya had been texting me updates on his increasingly desperate attempts to woo her like she was David Attenborough, documenting the mating rituals of some particularly stupid bird. We'd been treating it like entertainment, a harmless bit of fun at his expense. But now, watching him sit here and destroy our relationship for something that was never going to happen anyway, well, now it felt like something else entirely. Now it felt like an opportunity. The room seemed to shift around me, colors becoming more vivid, sounds more crisp. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses down, could smell the lingering scent of his cologne mixed with something that might have been guilt sweat. My skin felt hypersensitive, like every nerve ending was suddenly awake and paying attention. He'd stopped talking and was looking at me expectantly, probably waiting for tears or pleading or some kind of dramatic reaction. His eyebrows were doing that thing where they pulled together in fake concern, the same expression he'd worn when he told me my cooking was interesting, or that my new haircut was bold. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band being pulled taut, and I could see him starting to shift uncomfortably. He'd clearly expected me to say something by now, maybe ask if there was anything I could do to change his mind, or demand to know how long this had been going on, or break down crying so he could comfort me and feel like the good guy in this scenario. Instead, I was just sitting there processing. My mind was working like a computer running multiple programs at once, grief subroutine running in the background while the main processor was busy calculating possibilities. Because Maya and we'd been planning elaborate revenge scenarios since middle school when Tommy Patterson had pulled my hair and called me ugly. We'd turned petty vengeance into an art form, and Jake had just handed us the canvas of a lifetime. I could feel my lips starting to curve upward, just the tiniest bit, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop it. Not yet. I needed to let him finish his little performance first. I needed to let him think he was winning. So, I finally said, and my voice came out surprisingly steady, almost conversational. Maya, huh? He nodded eagerly, like I was finally getting with the program. Started talking about her laugh, her intelligence, the way she really listened to him. All the things she'd been mocking in our private conversations, all the reasons she'd been stringing him along for our mutual entertainment. Poor, sweet, stupid Jake. He had absolutely no idea what he'd just walked into. The first thing I did after Jake left, and yes, he actually had the balls to pack a bag right then and there, like he was some kind of romantic hero riding off into the sunset, was sit in my car for 20 minutes just breathing. Not crying, not screaming, just existing in this weird liminal space between my old life and whatever the hell was about to happen next. My hands were still doing that slight tremor thing, but now it felt less like shock and more like excitement. Like when you're at the top of a roller coaster and you can see the drop coming. I called Maya, obviously. She picked up on the first ring like she'd been waiting for it, which she probably had been since Jake had texted her earlier about having big news to share. Her voice had that careful, controlled quality she used when she was trying not to laugh at something inappropriate, and I could practically feel her vibrating with anticipation through the phone. She wanted to know everything, how he'd said it, what his face looked like, whether he'd actually used the word soulmate, like he'd threatened to in one of his previous attempts at romantic poetry. We met at our usual spot, this dingy 24-hour diner that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and had booths with cracked vinyl that had probably witnessed more breakups than a divorce lawyer. Maya was already there when I arrived, and I could see her trying to maintain a sympathetic expression while her eyes absolutely sparkled with mischief. She'd ordered us both pie, stress-eating protocol we'd established in college, and had her phone out, probably reviewing the extensive documentation she'd been keeping of Jake's pathetic courtship attempts. Sitting across from her, watching her try to balance genuine concern for my feelings with barely contained glee at the situation, I felt something click into place in my brain, like tumblers in a lock aligning perfectly. This wasn't just about my broken heart or his betrayal anymore. This was about justice. Cosmic, beautiful, absolutely devastating justice. Maya started laying out everything chronologically, like she was presenting evidence in court. The timeline was almost embarrassingly detailed. She'd been screenshotting his messages, saving his voicemails, even recording some of his more ridiculous pickup attempts when he'd corner her at parties. She had 3 weeks' worth of material documenting his systematic campaign to win her over, complete with timestamps and her running commentary about his techniques. The voicemails were particularly pathetic. Maya played a few of them for me right there in the booth, and I had to grip my coffee cup to keep from howling with laughter. There was one where he'd clearly been drinking and spent 4 minutes explaining why he thought they were twin flames, in this breathy, earnest voice that made him sound like a wannabe meditation guru. Another where he'd attempted to recite poetry, bad poetry, the kind that rhymed eyes with skies and heart with apart in completely predictable ways. But the real goldmine was the text messages. Page after page of Jake trying to sound deep and mysterious, sharing profound thoughts about life and love that were clearly copied from Pinterest quote boards. He'd sent her philosophical questions like, "Do you ever wonder if we're just souls searching for our other half?" followed immediately by shirtless gym selfies with captions like, "Getting swole for the right woman." The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. Maya had been playing along beautifully, giving him just enough encouragement to keep him coming back, but never actually agreeing to anything concrete. She'd perfected this art of responding to his romantic overtures with friendly but non-committal replies that he'd somehow interpreted as reciprocated interest. When he'd ask her out, she'd say she was busy but suggest they catch up soon. When he'd send her music that reminded him of her, she'd thank him for sharing but change the subject. She'd been leading him on a merry dance for weeks, and he'd been too blinded by his own ego to notice that she was never actually dancing with him. The more we talked, the more a plan started forming in my head. It was elegant in its simplicity, really. Jake thought he was leaving me for Maya, but Maya had no intention of being left for. He'd blown up his relationship with me for a fantasy that existed only in his own mind. All we had to do was let him find that out in the most spectacular, ego-crushing way possible. But I didn't want to just embarrass him. That felt too simple, too quick. I wanted him to really understand what he'd given up, what he'd thrown away for his delusions of grandeur. I wanted him to feel the full weight of his own stupidity pressing down on him like a physical thing. Maya was reading my mind, the way she always did when we were plotting something. She started talking about timing, about maximizing impact, about making sure he'd have an audience for his inevitable humiliation. Because that was the thing about Jake. He needed witnesses to his romantic gestures. He was the kind of guy who proposed on jumbotrons and wrote long Facebook posts about his feelings. His ego required external validation, which meant his destruction would need to be equally public. We spent hours in that booth, refining the plan, considering variables, anticipating his moves like we were playing chess against a particularly predictable opponent. Maya knew his schedule, his habits, his insecurities. I knew his triggers, his weak spots, the exact words that would cut deepest. Together we were building something beautiful and terrible and absolutely justified. The grief was still there, don't get me wrong. Every so often, I'd remember some sweet moment from our relationship, the way he'd make me coffee in the morning, or how he'd rub my feet after long days at work, and feel this hollow ache in my chest. 3 years of shared memories don't just disappear because someone reveals themselves to be a selfish asshole. But the grief was getting crowded out by something much more energizing, righteous fury wrapped in careful planning. Maya suggested we document everything, create our own timeline to match his. She wanted photos, videos, witnesses, evidence that would be impossible to deny or spin in his favor. She was thinking like someone who'd watched too many legal procedities, building an airtight case for the court of public opinion. I loved her devious little brain. We talked about his friends, his family, his co-workers, all the people who thought Jake was such a good guy, such a catch. They'd been telling me for years how lucky I was to have him, how devoted he was, how rare it was to find a man who really listened and communicated. Well, they were about to see just how well he communicated when he tried to explain why he'd left his girlfriend for a woman who was going to publicly, spectacularly reject him. The beautiful part was that we didn't have to lie about anything. We didn't have to manufacture drama or create false evidence. Jake had done all the work for us. Maya had months of documentation proving his pursuit of her while he was still with me. His own words, his own actions, his own delusional confidence would be the weapons we used against him. Maya started talking about his social media habits, how he always posted about major life events immediately, how he couldn't resist sharing his journey with his followers. She'd been watching his posts, noticing how he'd been increasingly vague about our relationship lately, probably laying the groundwork for this dramatic exit. He'd been crafting his own narrative, painting himself as the thoughtful, conflicted romantic hero who couldn't help following his heart. Well, we were about to give him a very different kind of story to tell. I could feel my energy shifting as we planned, moving from the heavy, sluggish weight of heartbreak into something sharper and more focused. My mind felt clear for the first time in hours, like someone had adjusted the contrast on reality, and suddenly everything was in crisp, vivid detail. The fluorescent lights in the diner seemed brighter, the sounds sharper, even the terrible coffee tasted more intense. Maya was getting that look she used to get when we were kids planning elaborate pranks on our teachers. Eyes bright, smile slightly feral, hands gesturing animatedly as she worked through logistics. She'd always been the strategist to my chaos agent, the one who thought 5 moves ahead while I was busy lighting fires. But this time, we had weeks to plan instead of minutes. This time we could be methodical. She started making lists on napkins, his regular hangouts, his favorite restaurants, the gym where he liked to show off, the coffee shop where he held court with his bros every Saturday morning. All the places where he performed his masculinity for an audience, all the stages where his humiliation would have maximum impact. We were mapping out his life like military tacticians planning a siege. The more we talked, the more I realized that this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about exposure. Jake had been living a double life for weeks, maybe months, thinking he was so clever and discreet. He'd been playing the devoted boyfriend to me while simultaneously pursuing Maya, convinced that he could have his cake and eat it too. He'd probably told himself he was protecting my feelings by waiting to leave me until he was sure Maya was interested. What a thoughtful, considerate cheater he was. But Maya and I had been documenting his hypocrisy without even realizing it. Every screenshot, every saved voicemail, every eye-roll-inducing attempt at seduction was proof of his calculated deception. We had evidence of who he really was beneath all his talk about communication and honesty and emotional intelligence. The plan was crystallizing now, taking shape like a sculpture emerging from stone. We'd let him think he was winning for a while, let him believe that leaving me for Maya was the smartest decision he'd ever made. We'd let him get comfortable in his new narrative, maybe even let him start bragging about it to his friends. And then, when he was feeling most confident, most secure in his romantic triumph, well, then Maya would finally give him an answer to all his romantic overtures. A very clear, very public, very final answer. But not yet. First, we had to set the stage. First, we had to make sure everyone was watching. The execution phase began exactly 1 week after Jake moved out, and watching him strut around town like some kind of romantic conquistador was almost too perfect to be real. Maya had given him just enough encouragement to make him think victory was imminent. She'd agreed to think about having dinner with him, maybe when the timing felt right, and his confidence was absolutely radioactive. I could practically see it glowing around him as he walked through our usual haunts, chest puffed out, stupid grin plastered across his face like he'd just solved world hunger. Maya and I had established our surveillance network with military precision. Her coworker Jessica worked at the coffee shop where Jake held court every Saturday. My friend Danielle was a regular at his gym. Maya's cousin worked at the restaurant where Jake had been trying to make reservations for their eventual date. We had eyes everywhere, and Jake was performing beautifully for his unwitting audience. The first phase was pure psychological warfare, letting him think he was winning while gradually escalating the stakes. Maya would respond to his increasingly bold text messages with just enough warmth to keep him hooked, but never quite enough to satisfy him. She'd send him ambiguous emojis that he'd spend hours analyzing with his bros, trying to decode her signals, like he was breaking enemy cipher. Meanwhile, I was getting daily reports of his behavior through our network of informants, and holy shit, was he putting on a show. At the gym, according to Danielle, he'd started working out shirtless whenever possible, checking himself out in the mirrors with this nauseating self-satisfaction. He'd been telling anyone who'd listen about his complicated situation, how he'd had to make the difficult decision to follow his heart, how sometimes you meet someone who changes everything, how he'd never believed in soulmates until now. The poor deluded bastard was workshopping his romantic narrative in real time, getting validation from his gym buddies who were probably just glad someone was finally talking about something other than protein powder and cryptocurrency. Jessica reported that his Saturday morning coffee performances had reached new levels of obnoxiousness. He'd been holding court at his usual table, pontificating about emotional maturity and the courage to pursue authentic connection. He'd actually used the phrase, "when you know, you just know," at least 6 times in one conversation, according to her count. She'd had to excuse herself to the bathroom just to text Maya about how hard she was trying not to laugh. But the real goldmine was his social media activity. Maya had been monitoring his posts obsessively, and Jake was slowly but surely building toward what was obviously going to be a grand romantic gesture announcement. His Instagram stories had evolved from generic gym selfies to deep thoughts about following your dreams and taking chances. He'd posted a quote about how life begins at the end of your comfort zone, with a sunset background that screamed, "I'm about to do something I think is profound." His Facebook activity was even more telling: vague posts about major life changes and exciting new chapters that were getting exactly the kind of engagement he craved. The beauty of social media narcissists is that they can't help themselves. Jake needed to perform his happiness, needed external validation for his choices, needed everyone to witness his romantic triumph. He was building toward something public and dramatic, which was exactly what we were counting on. Maya had been playing her part perfectly, giving him just enough rope to hang himself with while maintaining plausible deniability. When he'd ask directly about their connection, she'd redirect to talking about friendship and taking things slow. When he'd push for concrete plans, she'd mention being busy with work, but suggest they definitely needed to catch up soon. She was a master class in leading someone on without technically lying, and Jake was too blinded by his own ego to see the careful dance she was performing. 3 weeks in, he made his move. Maya showed me the text at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, and we both knew immediately that this was it, the moment we'd been building toward. He'd sent her this elaborate message about how he couldn't wait anymore, how he needed to show her how he felt, how he was planning something special that would demonstrate the depth of his feelings. He wanted to take her somewhere meaningful, somewhere they could really talk without distractions. Somewhere public enough to make a statement, but intimate enough for what he clearly thought was going to be a romantic breakthrough. He'd chosen the park downtown, the one with the little amphitheater where they hold summer concerts and community events. It was perfect, visible from multiple angles, always populated with joggers and dog walkers and families, close enough to the main shopping district that people we knew would definitely see whatever spectacle he was planning. Maya texted back that she'd meet him there Saturday at 2 p.m., and I could practically feel his excitement vibrating through the phone screen. That's when Maya and I shifted into the final phase of our operation. We spent the rest of the week coordinating our network, making sure we'd have witnesses positioned strategically around the park. Jessica would be jogging through at 2:15. Danielle would be walking her friend's dog nearby. Maya's cousin would happen to be getting coffee from the cart that's set up near the amphitheater on weekends. We even convinced my sister to bring her kids to play on the playground that had a perfect sightline to where Jake would undoubtedly stage his grand romantic gesture. But the real masterstroke was Maya's idea. She suggested we live stream it. Not obviously, not in a way that would tip Jake off, but she'd set up her phone to broadcast to a private Instagram story that included all of Jake's friends and family. She'd position it to look like she was just casually documenting her day, maybe getting some footage of the park for her social media. Jake would never suspect that his moment of romantic triumph was being broadcast in real time to everyone he'd been bragging to about his new relationship. Friday night, I barely slept. Not from anxiety exactly, but from this electric anticipation that made my whole body feel charged with potential energy. I kept running through scenarios in my head, imagining Jake's face when Maya finally gave him her answer, picturing the moment when his confidence would crumble and he'd realize exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. The thought of it made my chest tight with something that was half vindication and half genuine excitement. Saturday morning felt surreal, like the air itself was different. Maya came over early and we went through our final preparations like we were getting ready for battle. She practiced her rejection speech in my mirror, trying different tones and approaches until she found the perfect balance of kindness and finality. We'd decided she wouldn't be cruel. That wasn't the point. The cruelty was in the timing, the public nature of it, the fact that he'd spent weeks building up to this moment only to have it collapse spectacularly in front of an audience. Maya looked perfect, of course. She always did, but today she'd chosen her outfit with strategic precision. Cute enough that Jake would think she'd dressed up for him, but not so formal that it would seem like she was taking his romantic gesture seriously. Casual confidence that would photograph well when the inevitable social media documentation began. She'd even done her makeup with that subtle precision that would look effortless, but absolutely devastating when Jake finally understood what he'd been chasing. At 1:45, we drove to the park separately. Maya went straight to the amphitheater area, while I positioned myself at a coffee cart with a clear view, but enough distance to avoid being spotted. I ordered an iced coffee I didn't want, and found a bench that gave me perfect sightlines to the drama that was about to unfold. Jake arrived at exactly 2 p.m., and I could see him scanning the area like a general surveying a battlefield. He'd dressed up, button-down shirt, actual non-athletic shoes, hair styled with what looked like an entire container of product. He was carrying flowers, of course, and what appeared to be a small wrapped box that made my stomach drop with secondhand embarrassment. This fool had brought jewelry to what he thought was going to be their first real date. Maya appeared right on schedule, walking toward him with that easy smile she used when she was about to destroy someone's entire worldview. Even from a distance, I could see Jake's posture change when he spotted her. Shoulders back, chest out, the full peacock display of male confidence. He practically bounced on his toes as she approached, and I had to grip my coffee cup to keep from laughing out loud. They hugged, a perfectly normal, friendly hug that Jake clearly interpreted as something more significant based on how long he held on and the way he closed his eyes like he was savoring the moment. Maya extracted herself gracefully, and they sat down on one of the amphitheater benches, Jake immediately launching into what was obviously a prepared speech. I couldn't hear the words from my position, but I could read his body language like a book. Animated gestures, intense eye contact, the occasional touch of her arm or shoulder to emphasize important points. He was performing sincerity with every fiber of his being, probably recycling all the romantic rhetoric he'd been practicing in the mirror for weeks. Maya was nodding along, letting him build momentum, giving him just enough engagement to keep him talking. Our witnesses were positioning themselves perfectly. Jessica jogged past right on schedule, slowing her pace to stay within earshot. Danielle had found a spot near the playground where she could pretend to watch her friend's dog while actually watching the show. Maya's cousin was conveniently struggling with a complicated coffee order that required her to linger near the cart where she could see everything. 20 minutes in, Jake pulled out the flowers. Even from my distance, I could see Maya's face change slightly, still smiling, but with a quality that Jake was too focused on his own performance to notice. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. He was presenting the flowers like he was bestowing a crown, probably saying something about how they reminded him of her beauty, or some equally cliched bullshit. Maya accepted them graciously, smelling them appropriately, giving him the reaction he was clearly hoping for. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself just slightly apart from him even as she smiled. She was preparing for the kill shot. Then came the box. Jake's hands were actually shaking as he presented it, and I felt this weird mix of pity and satisfaction watching him in this moment of complete vulnerability. He'd clearly spent time and money on whatever was inside, had probably rehearsed his presentation speech, had built this entire moment up in his head as the romantic breakthrough that would validate all his efforts. Maya opened it carefully, and even though I couldn't see what was inside, Jake's expectant expression told me everything I needed to know. Jewelry. Probably something significant, something that represented his vision of their future together. Something expensive enough to show he was serious, personal enough to demonstrate how well he thought he knew her. Maya looked at it for a long moment, and I could see Jake holding his breath, waiting for her reaction. The park seemed to hold its breath with him. Joggers slowing their pace, dog walkers lingering nearby, families on the playground pausing their activities to watch this obvious romantic drama playing out in public. That's when Maya started talking, and even though I couldn't hear her words, I could read the shift in Jake's body language like watching a building collapse in slow motion. His smile faltered first, confusion creeping across his features as Maya continued speaking in that gentle but firm tone she used when she was delivering bad news. His posture changed next, shoulders sagging slightly as whatever she was saying began to penetrate his romantic delusions. Maya was handling it perfectly. Kind but clear, honest but not unnecessarily cruel. She was explaining I knew about her sexuality, about how she'd never been interested in him romantically, about how she'd tried to be clear about the boundaries of their friendship without being hurtful. She was probably apologizing for any mixed signals while simultaneously making it crystal clear that there had never been any signals to mix. Jake's face went through this fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, embarrassment, and then something that looked almost like panic as he began to process the full implications of what she was telling him. This wasn't just rejection. This was the complete destruction of the fantasy he'd been living in for months. This was the revelation that everything he'd sacrificed, everything he'd risked, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. Maya was still talking, probably being kinder than he deserved, probably trying to preserve some dignity for both of them. But Jake was clearly spiraling, gesturing more frantically now, probably trying to argue or negotiate or convince her that she was wrong about her own feelings. The flowers sat forgotten on the bench between them, and the little jewelry box was still clutched in his hands like a talisman that had lost its power. That's when Maya dropped the final bomb, and I knew it was coming because she glanced toward my position for just a split second before delivering what had to be the coup de grace. She was telling him about the screenshots, about how she'd been sharing his romantic overtures with me, about how we'd been friends throughout his entire campaign to win her affections. She was explaining that she'd never hidden her sexuality from him, that the information had been readily available if he'd bothered to actually pay attention to her as a person, instead of projecting his fantasies onto her. Jake's reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. The blood drained from his face so fast I thought he might actually faint. His mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out, like his brain was trying to process information that didn't compute. He dropped the jewelry box, and it bounced off the bench onto the ground with this pathetic little thud that seemed to echo across the entire park. Maya stood up then, still speaking gently but firmly, probably delivering some final words about hoping they could maintain their friendship, but understanding if he needed space to process. She was giving him an out, a graceful way to retreat and preserve whatever dignity he had left. But Jake wasn't taking the out. Instead, he was getting louder, more desperate, probably cycling through every manipulation tactic he'd ever learned. Bargaining, pleading, maybe even getting angry as the full scope of his humiliation began to sink in. Our carefully positioned witnesses were getting quite a show as Jake's carefully constructed romantic narrative collapsed into something much more ugly and desperate. Maya handled it like the absolute queen she was, calm, consistent, unshakable in the face of his increasing desperation. She wasn't cruel, wasn't enjoying his pain, but she also wasn't backing down or softening her message to make him feel better. She'd given him honesty, which was more than he'd given either of us. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Jake seemed to run out of steam. He sat there staring at the ground, the flowers wilting in the afternoon sun, the jewelry box lying forgotten in the dirt. Maya said something final, probably wishing him well or hoping he could learn from this experience, and then she walked away, just walked away. Left him sitting there in the amphitheater with the physical debris of his romantic fantasy scattered around him, and an audience of witnesses who'd just watched his entire worldview crumble in real time. I waited until Maya was safely out of sight before allowing myself to feel the full impact of what we'd just accomplished. The satisfaction was almost overwhelming, not just the revenge aspect, but the pure poetry of justice served. Jake had gotten exactly what he'd asked for, a clear, honest answer to his romantic pursuit. The fact that it wasn't the answer he'd wanted wasn't Maya's problem. As I walked back to my car, I passed close enough to the amphitheater to see Jake still sitting there, staring at nothing, probably trying to figure out how to explain this to all the people he'd been bragging to about his new relationship. How do you tell your friends that the woman you left your girlfriend for was never actually interested in you? How do you explain that you'd misread every single interaction, ignored every obvious signal, and built an entire fantasy relationship that existed only in your own head? The beautiful thing was that we didn't have to tell anyone what had happened. Jake's own behavior, his own public displays of confidence, his own social media buildup had created the perfect conditions for his humiliation to be completely self-inflicted. We'd just provided the stage and the timing. Everything else, the audience, the expectations, the spectacular failure, was all his own doing. Maya and I met up an hour later at our usual diner, and she was still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of it all. She'd done exactly what we'd planned, but actually executing it had been more intense than either of us had anticipated. Delivering that kind of crushing news to someone, even someone who deserved it, wasn't easy for someone with her natural empathy. But as we sat there processing what had just happened, sharing details and filling in each other's perspectives, I felt something settling into place in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, though that was definitely part of it. More like completion, like a story that had finally found its proper ending. Jake had made his choice based on fantasy and selfishness. Maya had given him reality and honesty. I had gotten to witness karma delivering a masterclass in consequences. Everyone had gotten exactly what they'd earned. The only question now was what Jake would do with this information, how he'd try to rebuild his narrative, whether he'd learn anything from this spectacular failure or just find new ways to blame everyone else for his poor judgment. But honestly, that wasn't my problem anymore. My part in this story was finished, and it had ended exactly the way it should have, with the truth delivered publicly to an audience that included everyone who'd ever listened to Jake's romantic philosophizing. Perfect. The aftermath was everything I could have hoped for and somehow more devastating than I'd even imagined. Jake's social media went completely dark for 3 days after the park incident, which in his world was basically the equivalent of entering witness protection. This was a man who posted gym selfies with inspirational captions about grinding and leveling up at least twice a week, who shared every minor life achievement like he was accepting a Nobel Prize. Radio silence from Jake meant he was either dead or completely psychologically shattered, and honestly, either option worked for me. Maya's cousin reported that the video had been making rounds through their extended social circle, not maliciously, but with that kind of second-hand embarrassment energy that makes people share things while covering their eyes. The footage was actually pretty tasteful. Maya had angled her phone so you could see the interaction clearly, but couldn't hear the specific words, which somehow made it worse. People could see Jake's body language, could watch his confidence crumble in real time, could witness the exact moment when his romantic fantasy collapsed, but they had to fill in the humiliating details themselves. And trust me, people's imaginations were far crueler than anything Maya had actually said. His gym buddies, according to Danielle, had gone from congratulating him on upgrading to asking increasingly awkward questions about when they'd get to meet his new girlfriend. The beautiful thing about Jake's personality was that he'd been so public about his romantic conquest that backing down quietly wasn't really an option. He'd painted himself into a corner with his own bragging, and now everyone was waiting for the big reveal that was never going to come. Jessica at the coffee shop told us that his Saturday morning appearances had become genuinely uncomfortable to witness. Apparently, he'd tried to maintain his usual routine that first weekend, showed up at his regular table with his regular order, but the energy was completely different. Instead of holding court with his dating wisdom and life philosophy, he'd just sat there scrolling through his phone with this hollow expression that made everyone else awkward by proximity. One of his regular coffee buddies had apparently asked about Maya, and Jake had just mumbled something about it being complicated before leaving without finishing his drink. The really beautiful part was watching his narrative slowly unravel on social media once he finally started posting again. He'd clearly spent those 3 days of silence trying to figure out how to spin this situation, and the result was this fascinating display of psychological gymnastics. He started posting vague quotes about fake people and learning who your real friends are. There were cryptic references to dodging bullets and everything happening for a reason. He was trying to reframe his humiliation as some kind of lucky escape, like Maya had done him a favor by rejecting him. But here's the thing about Jake. He wasn't smart enough to stick to a simple story. His ego couldn't handle being completely wrong about something, so he started dropping hints that maybe the situation wasn't exactly what it seemed. Maybe there had been complications he couldn't discuss publicly. Maybe Maya had been dealing with some things. That made a relationship impossible right now. He was trying to preserve the fantasy that she'd been interested, that there really had been a connection, that external circumstances had simply prevented their love story from unfolding. Maya found this absolutely hilarious, and honestly, watching her reaction to his pathetic attempts at face-saving was almost better than the original revenge. She'd screenshot his posts and send them to me with commentary that had me crying, laughing at inappropriate moments throughout my day. When he posted something about respecting people's privacy during difficult times, she sent me a voice memo that was just her cackling for 30 seconds straight. The best part was that his revisionist history was making things worse for him, not better. People who might have been sympathetic to a straightforward rejection were getting suspicious about his evasive, self-serving explanations. His friends weren't stupid. They could sense bullshit when it was being served to them with this much desperate seasoning. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more obvious it became that he was hiding something embarrassing. About 2 weeks after the park incident, I ran into Jake at the grocery store. Just my luck. I was in the cereal aisle wearing my rattiest sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, looking like I'd given up on life, when who should appear but my ex-boyfriend, clearly doing his own shopping for the first time in years. He looked terrible, honestly. Not in a satisfying way, but in that hollow, confused way that made me feel almost guilty for about half a second. He saw me before I could escape, and the look on his face was this perfect storm of shame, anger, and something that might have been relief. Like he'd been carrying around this confession for weeks, and finally had someone to deliver it to. We stood there in this awkward standoff next to the Lucky Charms, both knowing we couldn't pretend we hadn't seen each other, but neither sure how to navigate whatever this moment was supposed to be. "Hey," he said finally, and his voice had this defeated quality I'd never heard before. Gone was the confident, mansplaining tone that used to drive me crazy. This Jake sounded tired and small and genuinely broken. "Hey," I said back, "because what else do you say to someone who destroyed your relationship for a fantasy that never existed?" He opened his mouth like he was going to say something profound, probably some speech he'd been rehearsing about closure or understanding or maybe even an apology. But then he just closed it again and shook his head, like he'd finally realized that there weren't actually any words that could fix what he'd done or undo what had happened to him. Standing there looking at him, I felt this strange mix of emotions that I hadn't been expecting. There was definitely satisfaction. Seeing him reduced to this uncertain, defeated version of himself was undeniably gratifying. But there was also something else, something more complex and harder to name. Pity, maybe, but not the kind that made me want to comfort him. More like the pity you feel watching someone realize they've been the villain in their own story all along. "I know," he said suddenly, and I realized he was responding to something I hadn't actually said out loud. "I know you and Maya. I know she told you everything." The resignation in his voice was so complete that I almost felt bad for him. "Almost, yeah," I said, because there wasn't any point in pretending otherwise. "She did." He nodded like he'd expected that, like he'd been carrying around the knowledge of his own humiliation for weeks and had finally stopped trying to convince himself there was a way out of it. "I fucked up," he said, and it was the first completely honest thing I'd heard him say in months. I fucked up everything. And you know what? He had. He'd destroyed our relationship for a fantasy, ignored every obvious sign that Maya wasn't interested, constructed an elaborate delusion, and then acted on it with complete disregard for the actual human beings involved. He'd earned every bit of humiliation he'd experienced, every awkward conversation, every moment of social discomfort. But standing there in the cereal aisle, looking at this broken version of someone I'd spent 3 years of my life with, I realized that my anger had burned itself out somewhere along the way. The revenge had been perfect, the justice had been poetic, and Jake had learned exactly what his selfishness and delusions were worth. Mission accomplished. "Yeah," I said finally. "You really did." We stood there for another moment in that particular kind of silence that follows the complete destruction of someone's worldview, and then I grabbed a box of cereal I didn't want and walked away. Not dramatically, not with any parting shots or final clever remarks. Just away. Because this story was over, and we'd all gotten exactly what we deserved. Maya and I are closer than ever, bonded by shared combat and the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. Jake is presumably learning how to do his own laundry and figuring out how to rebuild his social life without the confidence that came from believing he was God's gift to women. And me? I'm single, happy, and absolutely convinced that karma is real and occasionally accepts applications for part-time employment. The best revenge really is living well. But sometimes, just sometimes, the best revenge is also watching someone face the natural consequences of their own terrible decisions while surrounded by an audience of everyone they were trying to impress. Perfect.